I am very delighted to welcome you to the Global Executive Leadership Initiative's webinar today entitled The Shadow Leadership: How Can You Create Positive Change for Yourself and Your Organization? The Global Executive Leadership Initiative is the first leadership development program designed to bring top leaders together from across the humanitarian and development sectors and takes them on a journey of self-reflection and growth to realize their full potential and drive for more effective action for people across the globe. This webinar is one of several programs that GELI provides to senior leaders to promote transformative leadership, which is the pinnacle of what GELI stands for. So if you are new to GELI, we invite you to learn more about our programs by visiting our website at www.geli.org or any of our social media channels to get more information. On behalf of GELI, I am delighted and feel it is my honor today to present to you our speaker for today, Dr. Ngao Motsei. Dr. Ngao, I'm going to refer to her moving forward, has served as a lecturer and lead faculty for the MBA in Management Consulting and the Global Executive Development Program at the Gordon Institute of Business Science at the University of Pretoria, South Africa, as well as faculty in the Gibbs Harvard Senior Executive Program in Africa. She currently serves as adjunct faculty and lead faculty in the Global Executive Development Program and as workplace bullying lead at the Gibbs Center for Business Ethics. Now is on the board of the International Association of Workplace Bullying and Harassment. She serves as the independent non-executive director of several companies in the financial services sector and is an ICF certified coach. Today, Ngao will share with us a concept called shadow leadership, which focuses on how we as leaders can create positive change for ourselves and the organizations we belong to. As you listen to Ngao, I want to remind you to send us questions, as I mentioned earlier, in the Q&A function. I also want to encourage you to take notes and reflect on the presentation and the points that she highlights today to see how it might encourage you to revisit your leadership approach and enhance your approaches and leadership skills moving forward. So without further ado, I present to you Ngao, our speaker for today.
Thank you, Felicia. Let me just get myself ready. Right. Thank you, Felicia, and good day, good morning, depending on which side of the world you're joining in. Thank you so much for spending time today to talk about this topic, leadership shadow, which is almost like quite topical and apt for the environment within which we are today. So I just want to start by saying we have all heard these phrases: actions speak louder than words, walk the talk, practice what you preach. The common central theme or message from these phrases is simply this: what we do as leaders is simply, if not more important than what we say. And this is the tenet of the shadow of the leader, which we're going to talk about today. As I was thinking about and preparing for this webinar, I couldn't help but think about this quote, one of the few probably least known quotes by Dr. King, which he made some 60 years ago at the Morehouse College commencement graduates from 1959 and also again in 1965 in Oberlin College. And he said, and I quote, "There can be no gainsaying of the fact that we are experiencing today one of the greatest revolutions that the world has known. Indeed, there have been other revolutions, but they have been local and isolated. The distinctive feature of the present revolution is that it is worldwide. The great challenge facing every member of this graduating class," in quotes, me, webinar delegates, "is to remain awake, alert, and creative through this great revolution." In the same speech, one of the things that he said was that the tragedy of most revolutions is that people sleep through them. And when you look at this quote, it could have been made last week, today, or yesterday, and it would have been relevant. And it kind of made me think that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Therefore, what do we as leaders need to do to break that cycle? In other words, to stay awake through the revolution and to break, I believe that to break the vicious cycle, the big question for leaders is, how do you lead into the future? How do you stay awake through the revolution? I believe it starts with the shadow you cast in your organization, community, society, or country. But for today, the focus will be on your leadership shadow in the organization. So staying awake through the revolution and leading into the future, therefore, thereby breaking the cycle, the vicious cycle of, staying the same, even though things are supposedly meant to change, it actually includes three things. Leading to the future requires compassion, empathy, respect, and transparent leadership. And all this, staying awake through the revolution and leading into the future, as I said earlier on, it starts with examining your leadership shadow. But before we even go to that, I'd like for you to consider this question, maybe write it down. Consider this question for a minute. Why do you do what you do? Why do you do the work that you do? Why do you do what you do? How has that evolved over the years? The reason that you do what you do, how has that evolved over the years? And as we go along, examining your leadership shadow might help you to reflect on these questions, including helping you to get some insights as to whether there has been some shifts in terms of why you do, the reason you do what you do, or whether you need to make some shifts in your leadership journey. Now, I just want to spend a bit of time. One of the things I said was that what leading in the future requires are those concepts, compassion, empathy, and transparent leadership. I just want to spend some time on that and explaining it. So compassion, there are many different and varying definitions of what compassion is. The definition I really, really liked is from a book I recently read by Brené Brown. I think it is her latest book titled Atlas of the Heart. And she defines compassion as the daily practice of recognizing and accepting our shared humanity so that we treat ourselves and others with loving kindness and we take action in the face of suffering. Now, for me, looking through this definition, the operative words are those that I've underlined: daily practice. Leadership and building competence is about practice, is about committing to something and doing it on a daily basis, and doing it even though you don't feel like doing that. The other two words are shared humanity. The world is polarized. We are so divided, and what happens in the world obviously impacts and has an impact on what happens in the organization. And often we forget that there is one thing that binds us together, and that thing that binds us together is our shared humanity. The last word is action. And perhaps this is the most important action, because for me, from where I'm sitting, leadership is action, not position. In other words, anybody can lead from wherever they are. Nobody needs a position in order to take action, particularly in the face of suffering. So these underlined words are very critical, for me at least, in terms of the definition of what compassion is. The next concept is empathy. Again, there are many different There may be many different definitions of what empathy is, but again, from the same book, what I like from Brené Brown, she defines empathy as an emotional skill, a skill set that allows us to understand what someone is experiencing and to reflect that understanding back. The one thing that she also says, which I found very, very interesting, and I'd like to share with you, we often say empathy is getting into somebody else's shoes, or walking into somebody else's shoes. And what she's saying is that we have to dispel the myth that empathy is walking in somebody else's shoes, because how can you? Nobody can walk in somebody else's shoes. Instead, what she says is that we have to be willing to be present, to listen to the story that the people or the person tells you about how it is in their shoes, and believe in them, even if your concept of how it might be in their shoes might be different to what you believe. So I want to repeat this. We need to dispel the myth that empathy is walking in someone else's shoes. Rather than walking in your shoes, I need to learn how to listen to the story you tell me about what it's like in your shoes, and believe you even when it doesn't match my experiences. In other words, hear the story. Do not insert yourself in their story. What we often do when we empathize, or we say we empathize, we listen to the story people are telling us, and we say something like, oh, I understand, it reminds me when this happened to me, this was my experience. And by doing that, by inserting yourself in somebody else's story, you break the connection, the empathy connection. The last concept I want to define or to look at is transparent leadership. That is required for leading into the future. And transparent leadership is simply leading with openness and honesty. And leading with openness and honesty requires courage. Courage to share the uncomfortable truths with your team or whoever it is that you're leading, to share your pain, your vulnerability, your frustrations. Transparency, compassion, and empathy is what you need to lead into the future, and is also very, very important to your leadership shadow, which we're getting into now. So then, what then is the leadership shadow? The leadership shadow is the unconscious influence of a leader, for better or for worse. And for better or for worse is very intentional, because what you do as a leader influences what other people do, or the people that you're leading do. So for me, leading into the future starts with examining your leadership shadow and having a roadmap as a leader to guide you as a leader. What I'm advocating, though, is making your influence as a leader conscious and intentional. The shadow, in other words, the shadow that you cast in your direct environment, in those that you lead, I'm advocating that it has to be conscious and intentional. And that's what I'm going to illustrate to you in a few seconds. But why is that important? Because the shadow, think about it, the shadow that great leaders cast extend far beyond their lives. Think of Nelson Mandela, for example, or Mother Teresa. Unfortunately, so does the shadows of the not so great leaders. Their shadow also would live on even when they have passed on. Similarly, each one of us has a shadow, and therefore we cast a shadow. We cast our own shadow around those that we live around those that we lead. So we influence those that we lead. The question, therefore, is what kind of shadow do you want to cast? Do you want to cast the shadow for better or for worse? The last thing I just wanted to, I have a book there that for those that want to read further that I recommend is The Leadership Shadow, How to Recognize and Avoid Derailment, Hubris, and Overdrive. Typically when somebody speaks about leadership shadow, we think about the dark side of leadership. What I'm emphasizing, what I'm focusing on today is the positive side of the shadow. In other words, the shadow that you intentionally and consciously cultivate and cast. So why does it matter? Why does the leadership shadow matter? Organizations are shadows of their leaders. That's the good news and the bad news. As a leader, depending on how you lead, how you interact with people, is very soon everybody else in your environment emulates you. It's not uncommon to say, and research has also shown that organizations tend to take the style and or personality of a leader. How a leader behaves and leads cascades throughout the organization, thus becomes the culture, it becomes the way we do things around here, which is why it is important always, if I'm to sound like a broken record, it's going to be this: be intentional as a leader, be conscious as a leader about your role, what is your purpose, and about what the shadow you want to cast. So what then? The leadership shadow is important because it is the bridge that connects your intention, what you stand for, in other words, why you do what you do, your cause, and ultimately it connects to the results that you produce. Now let's look at what it is. What is this leadership shadow that I've provided so far? The context, let's look at what it is. Again, there are different models. This is the model that I particularly like because it's implementable, it's applicable. Anybody else can have a look at it and apply it in examining their own leadership. Essentially, the leadership shadow has 4 basic elements. What a leader say. In other words, how I frame issues as a leader, the context I set as a leader, what I repeat, what I emphasize. The second element is how I act, my behavior, my symbols and relationships. Third is what I prioritize, the disciplines, the routines, the meetings that I hold, my standing meetings, who I interact with, and lastly, what I measure. What do I reward? What do I recognize? How do I hold myself and others accountable? So to create a positive change for yourself and your organization, all elements must be congruent. In other words, what you say must be congruent with how you behave, how you act, and your behavior, how you act must be congruent with what you prioritize, and ultimately what you prioritize must show in your results, in the results that you measure and the things that you hold dear. So my goal today is for you to walk away from this webinar with some understanding of your own leadership shadow, including an understanding of which elements of your leadership shadow are congruent and which are not, as well as have an understanding of what your leadership shadow action ought to be like in order for us to move you to some kind of action. Now let's go into how you may examine your leadership shadow. Now I just want to start by saying, if you want your leadership to make a difference, it first has to start with your intent, why you do the work that you do, why you do what you do, what is the purpose? What is your purpose? You must understand your influence. You must understand that as a leader, you do have influence. And therefore, you must be intentional about the impact that you want to make. That is the shadow that you want to cast. Because the path to your legacy and or the imprint you want to leave as a leader starts with ensuring that there is congruence in what you say, how you act, what you prioritize, and what you measure. Therefore, key to creating the shadow you want is awareness and intent. Now, I just want to illustrate, I'm going to take you through an example using myself as an example. I'm going to share with you my leadership shadow with a view of helping you and illustrating how you can cultivate and create your own leadership shadow. So my shadow, my intent, the shadow I want to cast and I continue to thrive to cast in organizations is what I call rehumanizing the workplace, one leader at a time. Therefore, central to everything, the work that I do is relieving suffering in the workplace. And that came as a result of my years in corporate and continuing to work also as a consultant, seeing the greatest suffering and pain that is caused by bullying and that is caused by abrasive leaders. So from then on, it became my mission or my purpose, what I call my purposeful life, to strive towards rehumanizing the workplace one leader at a time. And why one leader at a time? I work specifically with leaders because I believe that if we get it right at the level of the leaders, at the leadership level, then it's, the positivity is going to cascade throughout the organization, as I said, because, organizations tend to take the style and the personality of the leader. So using the same model, now let's examine my leadership shadow using this model, and I will break it down by looking at each element and finally bringing them all together to hopefully illustrate how you may also approach examining your own leadership shadow, and for you to get a sense of whether it is my leadership shadow is congruent or not. So let's first look at what I say. Remember, what I say is how I frame issues, the context setting, the context I set, what I repeat, and what I emphasize. And how I frame issues is that managing performance does not have to be abrasive. And where does that come from? Many of the times, the leaders that I work with, particularly those that have been accused of bullying, often they would say, but I'm not bullying anybody. I'm just a tough manager. I'm managing performance. And how I frame things is that managing performance does not have to be abrasive. And the context that I set, typically when I start getting invited into organizations is actually to say, and I've seen that also from research, many abrasive leaders are not aware of the impact of their action, because there's a thing that what they do, the harm that they cause people is intentional. But what I found is that it actually is not the case. And often it is said that, so-and-so, that's the way they are. They cannot change. I believe that they can change. Of course, there's got to be certain things in place in order for them to change. What I repeat is that it is important to manage performance and conduct. You can still be tough, be a tough manager and manage performance tough, and you can still do it in a way, in a way that does not leave people bruised and stressed out and feeling bullied. What I emphasize is, particularly when I engage with leaders, is what happens when leaders turn a blind eye. And typically what happens when leaders turn a blind eye on the reported abuse is that it becomes part of the way we do things around here, therefore becomes part of the culture. How I act. I exhibit behavior that is respectful and shows how it is to lead with care, even if you are managing performance and you are managing performance in a tough way if you say that you're a tough manager. I raise awareness about bullying at any opportunity I get, case in point. The relationships that are built, I identify researchers and practitioners with shared goals to create a critical mass, because multiple voices are more powerful than one voice. What I prioritize really comes from this quote from Elie Wiesel, who said, "Never allow anyone to be humiliated in your presence." So what I prioritize is not allowing anyone to be humiliated in my presence, because there is no such thing as an innocent bystander. Often what happens today in our lives, we see a whole lot of things, wrong things that are being done, suffering. We see suffering that is being caused to others, and we stand by and do nothing about it because we say, oh, as long as it does not involve me, I'm not going to do anything. What I also prioritize is raising awareness about workplace bullying and the impact on the individuals and on the culture, and ultimately even on the sustainability of organizations. My interactions are with what I prioritize is working with leaders who seek to create respectful, positive cultures. And my standing meetings, what I also prioritize is coaching, working with abrasive leaders. And this is also a very, very intentional choice of working or coaching abrasive leaders, because it's not many times that anybody would want to work with people that are being identified as bullies. But for me, that's one of the things that I prioritize. And for that, to that end, I actually certified myself as a specialist coach that works with abrasive leaders. And my approach is working with them as partners, curious and neutral, and not having taken a decision or a judgment based on what I may have been told. What I measure, what I reward, what I recognize are leaders' willingness to intervene on reported cases of bullying, abrasive leaders' willingness to change, and feedback on my own leadership shadow, and as well as leaders who take accountability for creating an environment where employees feel free, safe to speak up without fear of retribution or intimidation. So this is how it all comes together. What I say, is it aligned? Is it congruent with how I act? Is it aligned? Is it congruent with what I prioritize? Is it aligned? And is it congruent with what I measure? So this is my complete leadership shadow showing using the presented model. And my invitation therefore to you is moving you to action, is for you to identify your own shadow. And I'm hoping that the example that I've given you gives you enough illustration of how you can start with cultivating and actually hopefully reflecting as I was going along as to whether is what I say congruent to my behavior, to what extent is it or is it not, where are the areas I might improve. So as an invitation to identifying and examining your own leadership shadow, I invite you to write down actions you as a leader will take using this model to create congruence between what you say, how you act, what you prioritize, and what you measure. And that is going, in other words, create your own leadership shadow action plan. That doing that is going to culminate into your own leadership shadow action plan. So in conclusion, why I said everything that I have said. I hope it has led us to this. And I also remember this quote by Warren Bennis, which was made a long time ago, which is still very, very relevant today. A leader doesn't just get the message across. A leader is the message. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Now, thank you for a compelling and engaging presentation on the leadership shadow. And I think one thing that's very clear is that the leadership shadow is an intentional process, right? It's not something that's kind of haphazard or just something that's done, by happenstance. Is something that we should be intentional about. And I think your challenge of really looking at our own leadership purpose and aligning that with how we behave and how we act and how we set ourselves as an example and a role model is very important, that we should be intentional around that process and not just let it happen by natural instincts, and that where we are not aligned, we need to find ways to help us align ourselves. So your conversation has generated quite a lot of questions that we want to maybe bring around this idea of being intentional and maybe understanding the difference between leadership shadow and what we often refer to as legacy. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between leadership shadow versus like a leadership legacy?
All right, thanks for that question. And not getting into nuances, your leadership shadow is a stepping stone or the foundation to your legacy, because ultimately once you have cultivated your leadership shadow and you live it, that's what you are going to be known for. Because what you say, everybody's always going to recognize what you say and be able to see it in your actions and in what you prioritize. So ultimately, your leadership shadow, you being consistent in what you say and how you act, ultimately is going to lead into your legacy. And I think I made an example of, for example, Nelson Mandela and Mother Teresa. Everybody knows when you hear those names, what you connect who they are, who they were, with the work that they did and what the purpose of what they did was. So that's really where the connection is between leadership shadow and your legacy is. So your leadership shadow is the foundation, or is foundational to the legacy that you will leave or you will create as a leader. I hope that answers the questions. Does it do that? Does that answer your question?
I believe it does. And I think it also kind of highlights the importance of authenticity, because the examples that you raised in Dr. King and Mother Teresa, I mean, they were authentic to what they found their purpose to be as a leader and what their, intention should have been around in terms of how they presented themselves in those leadership roles. So I think, it's not only legacy, it's also the authenticity one brings to their leadership shadow that kind of contributes to the legacy that they leave behind. So I think you did a wonderful job in answering that question. You also talked about the leadership shadow's influence on culture and the culture that exists within the organization or the teams in which these leaders are overseeing. And might you be able to speak a little bit about the importance of psychological safety around this concept of leadership shadow, especially as it relates to international leadership and different cultural differences, but also in bridging that with your talk around being inclusive and having kind of an inclusive nature. Can you talk a little bit about psychological safety as it relates to that?
Psychological safety is an important factor in organization, and I think it also starts with compassion. One of the words I underlined was humanity, our common humanity. And often what happens in organizations is that our psychological safety is implied. Why do I say is implied? Is implied through our psychological contract. we don't define our psychological contracts. There are two types of psychological contracts: the overt or non-verbal, and the one that's actually spoken and written. And it differs from, for example, your employment contract. And I'm taking this long route to show how it connects to psychological safety. Psychological safety comes from knowing that if I do this, I will not be punished. And with psychological contract, we often infer that if I do this, this is going to happen. Now, to create a psychological safety, you have to, the terms of engagement have got to be transparent. It has to be spelled out. For example, this is what we stand for. This kind of behavior we are not going to stand for. If this happens, this is what's going to happen. There are going to be consequences around that. So psychological safety is created by being specific, and at the risk of sounding like a broken record, by leaders being intentional about this is what we stand for, this is the behavior, for example, that we're going to take, and this is the behavior that we're not going to stand. And if you do this, these are the consequences, because often we also don't spell out what the consequences might be. So part of it might be that everybody is treated equally, everybody is treated with respect, and everybody, the whole thing about empathy, you have to understand, instead of walking in my shoes, understand what it is like to be me, that might look or sound different to you, that might come from a different background. And when I tell you that, is for you to actually understand and believe it. So that's where psychological safety comes from seeing everybody else's story is true. There is no single truth. There are multiple realities and multiple truths. The most important thing is to create the red thread. What is the red thread that goes through all our differences, all the diversities? What is the glue that holds us together?
Right. And I would assume, using your example of the abusive leader or the leader who's been bullying, that actually threatens the psychological safety, right? And the psychological contract that exists. If they're not living according to that psychological contract of protecting the environment, being respectful, appreciating diverse opinions, and they're enacting in an abusive way, that actually threatens the psychological safety that could exist within that organization or that team, correct?
Absolutely, it does. It does, as particularly when leaders do nothing, when that abusive behavior is being reported. Because when you do nothing, by implications, it almost means that it's okay, you are complicit. But as a leader, by not taking action against behavior that does not build, that is tantamount to or against your values, it means that you are complicit. You're communicating, indirectly communicating to everybody that it's okay to do that. And hence, before you know it, everybody does that. Because there's no retribution for behaving in that way.
Right. So the next question that's linked to this conversation is about the code of conduct. So how do you turn that implied psychological contract into something that's like a code of conduct that's embedded in the workplace, so that everyone's held accountable to abide by this sense of a code, of a standard of how we interact and how we relate to one another in the workplace? What would be your suggestion around to make that more explicit as opposed to something that's implied?
Thanks for the question. So first and foremost is actually to have that formally and written and documented. And part of what it must do what it must contain is what to do, for example, when people feel that they, they are leaders. How do you hold leaders accountable? What to do, for example, I'll use my, my rehumanizing organizations bullying, for example, what to do when you feel that you are being bullied. It has to be explicit. But most importantly, the paper, as we all know, a paper, you can have the best policy, but it's just as good as the paper that it's written on if it's not enforced. And how do you enforce it? You enforce it by leaders actually walking the talk, showing the way, and actually behaving in a way that they want everybody in the organization, everybody in the that they lead in a way that they want for them to behave. So it's one thing, it's a good start to have a good a code of conduct or to have a policy, but it's even more important for leaders to behave, to exemplify that which they speak about in those documents. In other words, the environment that they want to create, which is why it is important for leaders to be clear about what it is that they want to do and why, and what is their purpose and what they say, to make sure that everything they say and do is congruent with what they say the organization stands for. Because ultimately, leaders are the holder of the mission, of the vision and the mission and the values and all those wonderful things that we talk about in organizations. So they have to lead the way, and they lead the way. The best way to lead the way is through behavior, exhibiting the behavior that they want to see in their organizations.
Excellent, thank you. So let's focus our attention on the leader now, if you will. And you talked a lot about an abrasive leader. And I think in many instances, the abrasive leader is someone who's apparent to most people in the organization. Like, people typically notice that. That's, it's visible behaviors that we see. But then there are also those leaders who may be more unobtrusive in how they behave, and it's a little less apparent that they're actually causing damage. May not necessarily be described as bullying, but they're creating kind of this uncomfortable environment for people kind of behind the scenes. What would be, what about those kind of managers, and how does the leadership apply to that type of leader or manager in the workplace? And what would be your guidance for addressing that or helping to facilitate change in people who aren't that abusive leader, but they're also not being a positive leader in the workplace?
Yeah, so you cannot, my starting point is going to say, you cannot address what is not stated, right? And also the other reality is that, as I said, there's a lot of fear in organizations, and fear when people see something, they're fearful to speak up, because they, we often hear of the common phrase that people use, doing this might be career limiting. So it starts initially with creating an environment where people can actually feel free to be able to speak out without feeling that if I speak out, it might be career limiting. Coming back to your question, not many people have got a lot of self-awareness. The starting point with the leaders, especially those that are subtle, whose behavior might be subtle, and they may not be, what more often than not, what happens is that, people, they may not even be aware of their own behavior. They may not be aware that the way they are showing up, the way they are being, is impacting the environment in a certain way. I often say that one of the things to look out for those kinds of leaders, or any other leader, is listen to what people say. Some people might be wanting to transfer out of your department, that leader's department, or they may not want to transfer into that leader's department. Or there might be things like, be careful, don't do this, don't do that, don't wrap so-and-so, don't wrap them in the wrong way. So the responsible leader and responsible leadership, when those nuances and perceptions, and you become aware of those perceptions, it is important for you as a leader to intervene. And part of it might be, you know, through coaching or providing feedback to the leader that this is what I'm hearing, these are the perceptions I'm hearing. You are very important to us. I wouldn't want, it doesn't serve you to have these kinds of perceptions around you, nor does it serve the organization to have these perceptions around you, and therefore offer some kind of support, some kind of interventions. But what I'm saying is that there are always telltale signs, and which we often avoid or turn a blind eye on. So when that happens, it is important not to ignore that, especially when nobody's talking, but we can actually see those telltale signs.
Yeah, and from your response, you also highlight that those telltale signs are actually showing up in the bystanders that you mentioned earlier during your presentation, that rumor about don't transfer into that department. Those are the bystanders who are sharing those stories, right? From the experiences or the reputation, if you will, that they're hearing about this leader who may be more subtle in their approaches. So I think that that's an interesting concept. Can we talk a little bit more about who is a bystander? And you mentioned that there is no innocent bystander in these situations. So who is a bystander, and what are those relationships between this leadership shadow and the people who can be influenced by the leader who hopefully is intentional about their leadership shadow? Can a subordinate be a bystander, or is the bystander someone else?
No, anybody can be a bystander. Essentially, in any situation, when somebody that observes something being done, something harmful, or a behavior, a negative behavior that consistently being meted to somebody else, and not doing anything about it. Because oftentimes the response is, oh, I'm quite happy and comfortable as long as that thing, whatever it is not happening to me. That's what a bystander is. Somebody that's not directed, nothing, no negativity is meted against them. However, they are party in observing that and not doing anything about it. Why I say that there is no such thing as an innocent bystander is because that there are no guarantees. If you don't intervene, there are no guarantees that whatever it is that might be happening might not happen to you, because, you know, it might be somebody else. Tomorrow, it might be you. So part of being, hence the importance of creating a leadership shadow that that actually stands on something. What is your purpose? What is your foundation? What is it that you want to create as a leader, where everybody, you know, may not even feel a need to be a bystander, because they know that if they say something, they are not going to be reprimanded or you know, further intimidated or anything of that sort.
Great. So you mentioned positive leadership, and I think all leaders intend to lead in a positive way or behave in a positive way, but some of that may come with some perceived risk, right? Some leaders may feel as though if they lead in a positive way, their good intention may be misused by team members, or they've built themselves around a reputation of leading differently, and now trying to lead in a more positive way, or in a way with empathy and transparency, may be a different reputational risk for them. What are your thoughts around the dangers or the hazards of following the leadership shadow, and the risk that they may be misused or misinterpreted if one were to be more intentional around their leadership?
The first question really is, whatever it is, the leadership shadow you are cultivating, is it positive? What is it intended to? Part of it, you know, having a strong and a positive leadership shadow sometimes takes courage. Courage in the sense you might be in a situation, you might be leading in a context where you, even as a leader, are afraid to take a stand. So taking a stand against what might be a popular standing view, that is courage. But the thing also is that the thing about leadership shadow is not just about you. It's about it's more than you. It's about what you wanting to create for the collective, for the community, for the community of employees or whoever you are leading. So part of that courage is the courage to actually stand out yourself and create, even knowing and understanding that doing so might also be career limiting for you, or there might be repercussions for yourself. So, I mean, I can't think of anything, an example that comes to mind now, given where we are. You know, look at the people that have been protesting in Russia, for example, against the war, knowing exactly what it is that lies ahead of them. That takes courage. So part of the courage and that's required is to take risks yourself, but it's more, the question is, what is the risk of taking that risk vis-a-vis not doing anything about it? And not doing anything about it and voicing your voice is probably much of a bigger risk.
Great. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to try and merge a few questions together, get a few concepts in at the same time. So as you were going through your presentation, a few leadership styles came to mind that I think linked to what you were sharing: authentic leadership, contextual leadership, situational leadership. But would you say leadership shadow is a leadership style, or is it something that's influenced by a variety of styles? And what role does situation or context play in this idea of a leadership shadow?
I think style is not, what is more important is this principle of leading with care. And I don't want to get into the nuances or be dragged into leadership styles, because then it becomes this, that, or the other. I'd rather, you know, we focus our conversation on what is at the center of a leadership shadow. Is it centered around care, leading with care, leading with the understanding that, you know, our humanity, we are connected by humanity. We share the same pain, we share the same, humanity essentially binds us together. And what therefore is important is understanding that everybody is unique and is different, and they have a right to be unique and different and accept them as they are. It's more also about, I often use the difference between inclusion and belonging. Inclusion for me doesn't go far. Inclusion is almost being invited for me. Exactly. It feels like being invited, and therefore for you to be included, you have to change something about yourself in order to fit. Whereas belonging is about being accepted exactly the way you are without expecting for you to change. That is the leadership shadow. A positive leadership shadow is one that is anchored around promoting belonging, where everybody feels that I am part of this. I am part of something, and I'm being allowed, I have the full permission to be who I am without having to morph myself to fit within the context there within which I am.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I like the leading with care and the belonging principles that you shared. And I think that that does kind of go beyond kind of our traditional leadership styles, which don't focus on those two aspects of leadership as much. So I think one of the questions that I will end on that I think will be an excellent opportunity for you to talk about the extent to which leaderships can act, building on your leadership as an action. And that is, can you max out? Like, can you have a certain number of challenges that at some point you can't be effective anymore as a leader? Like, you have so many challenges that you face and you're trying to do it with care. You're trying to, to be empathetic and you're trying to be transparent, but there are just so many challenges that you're just not effective anymore. Is, from your perspective, is there a point in which leaders max out? And if so, how do I get feedback as a leader on how I'm showing up and whether I'm appearing exhausted or I feel like I'm at the end of my leadership capacity? Where can I get resources for feedback and help?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'm going to say is very good leaders are reflective people. They reflect, they take time out to reflect. And very good leaders also not just receive feedback, but they ask for feedback. So my thing really is that it starts with self-awareness, being aware of yourself, being connected and being truthful. And when you feel like I'm no longer being effective. So take a pause, reflect, and remember, one of the things that I said was transparent leadership. And transparent leadership is about also sharing your vulnerability. So what do you surround yourself, or do you have a handful of people that you can go to and be completely vulnerable with them, that you trust, that where you know that you're going to be judged? After all, we are all human. So part of that starts with transparent leadership, the courage to be vulnerable and to be able to have your go-to people. It's always great to have one or two or three people that you can be completely vulnerable with and honest with, who they can give you the best feedback. And it's always good for leaders also to have what I often call them the thinking partners. What are your thinking partners and what are your feeling partners? And it's also useful. Very good leaders often, over and above the things that I've mentioned, also have coaches, people that can provide mirrors for them. But your own employees can provide your mirror. You just have to open your mind and to be open to seeing what they put in front of you.
Excellent. Now, I've written a lot of notes and taken many tips. I hope our participants have as well. This has been a very insightful conversation. Is there any final closing thoughts you would like to share as we bring this session to a close?
So perhaps apart from saying thank you, my parting words would be: nobody knows the impact that they have, nor should you as a leader be focusing on what impact asking yourself the question, what impact am I having? The impact that you can have is in the receiver. It's in the eyes of the receiver. So it's also important for the leader to be close to the people that they lead, which means knowing when to lead and knowing when to follow. Because in certain instances, people that are your followers might be the best people to lead in certain contexts. So I probably just want to leave you with the good leaders are also good followers, because you really truly know who you are, you know your limitations, and good leaders also surround themselves with good leaders and people that oftentimes are even better than them, are more competent than them in certain areas. That is true leadership.
Thank you so much. for those thoughts. And thank you so much for your presentation today. I invite everyone to take a moment to fill out the evaluation as they are parting us. And I also invite everyone to join us for future webinars such as this one. Please check our social media channels. I think that information has been placed in the chat for you to reference for future webinars such as this. Thank you, Dr. Motsei, and thank you all for attending. And that concludes our session for today. Applause to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.